Today's scripture reading will be from Mark. But in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven. The powers of the heavens shall be shaken. They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. See also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all of the things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about the day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Holy Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or at cockcrow or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you all is keep awake.
There are very few times in life when the stark differences in religions can be seen as clearly as when those of us who live here in Springfield go downtown on the first Friday of a month to First Friday Art Walk and see the bearded, coverall-wearing Mennonites holding signs on street corners. Now, for the benefit of our YouTube and iTunes listeners and viewers, let me just say that there's lots of different kinds of Mennonites, and sometimes Mennonite churches are peace churches. They're environmentally aware. They're very sympathetic with a lot of the issues that we hold dear. But here in Springfield, we have a particular variety of Mennonites who are convinced that all the rest of us are just absolutely horrible sinners on the fast track to hell, and that the world itself is about to be snuffed out of existence. You don't run into that kind of Mennonite everywhere you go. We're just lucky here in the Ozarks. You can almost forget that those sorts of religious beliefs are still around until you see those guys holding up their signs, "The party ends in hell," scowling at all of the largely college-age crowd that is moving on First Fridays from one art gallery to a bar to another bar and another bar. There's not a lot of art at the Art Walk, but there's a lot of bars. Women dressed like that, men acting like that. It's really kind of a wonder that more of the young Mennonites don't just drop their signs and go running to join the crowd. I don't know what holds them back sometimes. But they do have a worldview. Admittedly, it's a pretty dour, repressed, and unworkable worldview, but it's theirs, and no one can take it away from them, and nobody else wants it anyway. In all seriousness, I shouldn't say, though, that no one wants it, because people under serious duress often come to the conclusion that the world is so messed up that it's surely about to blink out of existence one way or another. I was invited to give a series of lectures in a preaching school in Ecuador a few years ago, and after a full day of struggling, and it was struggling, with trying to speak Spanish and them trying to understand my Spanish, and I had a translator there who was attempting to translate my historical Jesus lectures into that delicate blend of Quechua and Spanish necessary to communicate with some of the most rural preachers in the Otavalo area of Ecuador. But finally, at the end of the day, it came time for questions. But all of their questions were about what I believed were the signs of the end of the world. Not a thing I had mentioned had penetrated their awareness, but that was the only thing they wanted to think about. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the Quechua are so poor, they are so desperate, that they have seen very little reason for hope in any earthly future since the Spanish first came to the shores of South America. So for them, the best hope that they have is that God's going to destroy the existing order and bring about something that's better, that has more hope, that allows them to have a happy life. Now, we've seen the rise of end-time religions in America, particularly in times of war or in times of great economic depression. When people are desperate enough to believe that they've got no future in this world, they start to be attracted to the kind of religion that locks them into sort of a permanent despair about life in this world and invests itself entirely in hopes in a life after death, or a life in a world after this world's been blown to pieces. Now, I'll confess that even I sometimes succumb to those theological views. Most recently, when I heard that there was actually going to be a fourth Twilight movie. But that may just be a personal fear of mine. But you talk about a coming cataclysmic end of the world is one of the things that we also inherit in our biblical tradition. If you're going to read the Christian Bible, you're going to read any number of passages about a coming cataclysmic end of the world. In fact, many New Testament scholars will suggest that this text that Ashley read for us just now from the 13th chapter of Mark, they call the Little Apocalypse. There are those that suggest that is the oldest fragment of any part of any gospel. It may have circulated around Jerusalem before the Romans destroyed the temple and carried out a virtual Holocaust against the Jews and the early Christian movement. Now, most of the Jesus Seminar scholars tend to believe that Jesus didn't really say anything about a coming end of the world. I'm less certain about that. It's one of the areas where I tend to disagree with the seminar, because most of the intertestamental literature, virtually everything found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of the Essene literature, was all apocalyptic, virtually all of it. And that's the community that John the Baptist comes out of, and that's the community that Jesus came out of. And in the earliest part of the Christian era, almost all the literature you see being produced is apocalyptic in nature. We've got the book of Revelation in the New Testament, but there were lots of other apocalypses that were being written in that time. So it really wouldn't surprise me if Jesus is emerging from an apocalyptic community and the community that follows him is largely apocalyptic. It wouldn't surprise me if Jesus also took a fairly apocalyptic worldview. The problem is we don't want him to, because we just hate it when Jesus is wrong. And it's clear that all those apocalyptic predictions were entirely mistaken. But in these days, in the 21st century, we now have our own prophets of doom. And they come to us from the scientific community rather than from the religious community. Where I think the Bible gets this apocalyptic vision right, where I agree with it and where I cannot escape the truth of it, is in the presumption that human sin is leading up to the destruction of the earth. That's true. That's true enough. And in Jesus saying to people, you've got to wake up. You've got to be aware. You can't keep burying your head in the sand. In the ancient world, people feared nature, but now the tables are turned, and nature has reason to fear us. We have to recognize that the Bible teaches us principles of living, but the Bible is actually very, very low on specifics that are relevant to us in dealing with problems that are purely modern problems. Before the internal combustion engine, before people mined coal in large amounts and burned it in densely populated areas, there just were not the issues that really are of vital importance to us today. When we first began looking at the possibility of starting a progressive church in the most unlikely place in America that a progressive church could be started in, several of us were meeting in the basement of a Methodist church downtown and reading together Bob Edgar's book, Middle Church. Edgar was both a former member of Congress and a former general secretary of the National Council of Churches. And he was trying to write a book that gave the existing church the opportunity to envision a future because you've got to see that mainstream denominations are all in rapid decline. The church that I was a pastor of when I first came to Springfield, Missouri, part of the Disciples of Christ, the total number of people attending a Disciples of Christ church in Springfield, Missouri has gone down by 70% in the last 20 years. There will not be an extant mainstream church of the type that we grew up with. They are going out of existence. So Bob Edgar is saying, what kind of emerging church can survive? What kind of church will the next generation have if they have one at all? And he came up with 3 issues around which, if the church is to be relevant in a new century, there are 3 issues that an emerging church has to address. The first is the achievement of peace. The second is the end of poverty. And the third is the restoration of the planet. Now, advocating for peace and working to end poverty, that's a no-brainer. I mean, if you read the Bible, that's just all there. Any church that is not working as its almost central purpose to advocate for peace and the end of poverty has not yet read the Bible. There's no way to say that the Bible is your book and not be an advocate for the end of poverty and for the advocacy of peace. But this environmental piece, that's harder to get at. It's super relevant in the 21st century, but biblically, it's harder to get at because there is no thou shalt recycle in the 10 Commandments. But the principle really isn't hard to get at. And the first one really is related to poverty because pollution almost always disproportionately affects the poor. We put our toxic waste dumps in the most impoverished areas. Rising sea levels will primarily displace the poor. In the United States, oceanfront property is the most desirable property, and that's where the richest people in America live. But that isn't true in most of the world. Mostly, it's very poor people who are fisher persons and people. Fisherman just doesn't seem like that ought to be said in a progressive church, but fisher person doesn't really sound right either, does it? But the number of people that will be displaced when the sea level rises by 3 or 4 feet are primarily very poor people. As well, the toxic chemicals that we put into our environment, our water and our air, that create first major respiratory problems, but then also a number of other cancers and things that come from it. Again, this makes a huge difference between whether you've got good insurance and good health care or you don't, or whether you live in the kind of environment where you breathe filtered air or you don't. So the poor are the most vulnerable in environmental hazards. But one of the first fishing lessons that I learned when I was just a boy in Kentucky is that you have to keep refreshing the water that you keep your live bait in, because the crawdads are constantly fouling the water in the bucket where they are with their own waste, and they will kill themselves with their own waste in a matter of hours. So the larger truth for us, my fellow crawdads, is that if we continue to foul the only fishbowl that we've got to live in, there will be no habitable world for future generations. But pollution is a part of the economy, and because of that, it's very, very difficult to get us to change our ways. During the BP oil spill just a year ago, we went through weeks and weeks and weeks of absolutely intolerable corporate lies about how much oil was being spilled and how little of an impact it would have on the environment. Even while the oil was still gushing into the Gulf, there was tremendous political pressure being brought to bear on President Obama to approve of more offshore drilling before anything was done to actually change the safety of offshore drilling. We've approached the environment with all the forward-looking discipline of a crack addict. Approving BP for any more offshore drilling would be like hiring Casey Anthony to run our nursery back here. Okay, she was found not guilty. But like BP, I'm pretty sure that doesn't mean the same thing as innocent, right? She's not innocent. A couple of months ago, George Mason University did a survey on political groups and their beliefs about global warming. And it's no surprise that the overwhelming majority of Democrats and independents reported that they believed in human-caused climate change, while the majority of Republicans and Tea Party members did not. And I don't want to sound partisan about this, because I think that what we see there goes far, far beyond politics, something much deeper than politics. What we see there is the fact that people have difficulty acknowledging facts when it affects their pocketbook. So political parties that are more directly connected to corporate businesses are going to have a greater difficulty in acknowledging what is true if once you have acknowledged it, you are going to have to change your behaviors. It's no great wonder that T. Boone Pickens, the well-known Oklahoma liberal and environmentalist, believes that natural gas is the answer to our nation's energy problems, because I've read some estimates that T. Boone Pickens owns about 40% of the existing natural gas in America, and he would like for you to want to buy more of it. Once you acknowledge the hard science about global change, global climate change, then what necessarily follows is that we must change our impact on the environment. But the people who make an awful lot of money off of burning coal and building cars want to keep saying that the jury is out on global warming. I personally felt like the answer was around the corner because we were reaching peak oil. We were going to have to start building cars out of something else. And then we decided that the dirtiest form of petroleum available, tar sands, we've actually got in huge supplies. So if we are willing to foul the environment at a much greater rate than we do with crude oil by processing tar sands, then we'll be able to keep driving independent cars for another 100 years. Now, we might not be able to breathe the air or drink the water, but we can drive the car. And it's very, very difficult to get people to actually change their way of thinking until they absolutely have to. The church is often afraid to speak when speaking might alienate donors or members. I mean, ultimately, when I was a denominational pastor, our denominational handlers paid virtually no attention to us until it came time to fill out the report about how many new members you got that year, what your average attendance is, and how much money you were sending to the denomination. So there's tremendous pressure on preachers to keep attendance levels up and to keep giving up, because that's how their self-esteem or their value as a human being is gauged, not based on how much truth you tell, but how many people you have in the pews and how much money you donate. So to decide to ignore those numbers in favor of the truth takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of time to get to the point where you're willing to do that. So preachers tend to say what their constituents want to hear. I mentioned loud religious voices, and whenever I do, I always think of Jerry Falwell, who famously said just before his death, Jerry Falwell said this on TV, "The fact is that there is no global warming. I urge everyone to go out and buy an SUV today." Now, folks, you can't make that stuff up. I mean, that is crazy at a level that you just absolutely couldn't write into a comedy or a fiction novel and have anyone buy it. But that is the truth of a lot of the religious mindset, is say whatever you think people want to hear, regardless of what's actually going on right outside your stained glass window. The first order of business of the church is to speak the truth to power. We cannot be afraid to bring this urgent message that the time to act on behalf of the planet is right now. We have to wake up, and no small symbolic measures should either silence us or placate us. This is not a time when collecting aluminum cans or even buying a hybrid car can stem the tide of environmental damage. We have to move rapidly towards alternative energy sources. We need to rebuild the infrastructure of mass transit. If using white shingles actually reduces home energy consumption by 20%, then the roofing choices in America should either be a photoelectric cell or a white shingle. If we know that white shingles reduce energy use by 20%, why can you buy anything but a white shingle? If you are more willing to kill the planet than to suffer some aesthetic loss of color coordination with your brick, then you just don't understand the crisis that we're in. Now, I don't want to talk about this in a way that would make me sound like the doomsday prophets down on the street corners this Friday night, because I do have hope. But that hope is predicated on the people of faith having the courage to take the truth to the streets. We have to change the way we think. We have to change the way we live. We have to change the way we buy. We have to change the way we vote. And we have to stop letting the corporations and government agencies roll over us and make us play like we're dead when they lie to us, because we want our children and our grandchildren to have a chance to live. We have to say to the climate change deniers this simple truth, that science is not a liberal plot.
Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.